And then he goes off the deep end into areas that have nothing to do with the current body of evidence and scientific literature about sodium, salt intake, and health. So there's a very interesting strategy that's going on here. He starts with some area related to the regulation of thirst, mainly thirst and the excretion of water to maintain osmotic homeostasis. And then he launches into an entirely different topic that is somewhat related, but not built upon the first 46 minutes whatsoever. The knowledge does not build upon the first 46 minutes, but it appears to maybe a layperson that these things are related and one is building off the other. It is not. Hey, everybody. This is Kevin Bass at thedietwars.com. And in this video, I want to discuss this Huberman Lab podcast episode number 63, called Using Salt to Optimize Mental and Physical Performance. And specifically what I want to do is analyze and dissect the entire podcast, piece by piece. I want to do this because I think it's filled, although not entirely, there's a good proportion of the podcast that's good, it's filled with a great deal of misinformation. The main reason I think this is the case, or one of the main reasons, or one reason, and we can discuss this in more detail later on in this particular podcast episode of mine, is that Dr. Huberman is an Element affiliate. And as an Element affiliate, he gets 15% for every purchase of Element on into his account. Whenever people buy Element through his links. So as we can see with the video description, thank you to our sponsors. There's 3 sponsors, and the middle one is Element. And when you click on Drink Element, this particular link, you are directed to a place where you can purchase Element on the Element website using his affiliate link. Now, if Huberman sells you on this idea that salt and consuming more salt is good for you, it's good for your mental health in particular, is I think the main claim that he's making in this podcast. It'll help you to feel better. Then for each person he convinces of that, he makes 15% on their purchase. Now, just a one-time purchase of this Element Recharge, if you click his affiliate link, is $45. Now, 15% of $45 is what? $6.75. So for every person clicking that, Huberman makes $6.75. Now, he has on this one YouTube channel podcast video, he has 680,000 views and 15,000 likes. And if just 1,000 of all of those, so 1 in 680, just 1,000 of all of those buys Element from his podcast episode, he makes $6,750. And of course, it's not just the YouTube channel that's huge. It's also his podcasts on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So there's no telling how much money he makes through this affiliate link. But it's a lot. And if he can convince you and persuade you that you should drink more of it, then he makes a lot of money. Now, I criticized Dr. Huberman earlier in the year, before he made this podcast episode, for peddling salt when it could be, in fact, harmful for health. In fact, there's a good deal of evidence that excess intake of salt, according to all the major health organizations in the entire world, excess consumption of salt is harmful in the same way that excess consumption of sugar is harmful. Sugar tastes good. It provides energy. We like it because it provides energy. That's why we've evolved taste receptors for sugar, because sugar indicates energy. It also indicates vitamins and minerals. It's a signal for fruit. In the same way that sugar tastes good and can be good to a degree, say whenever it's in fruit, and it's evolved to be good for you, salt has the same effect. Salt is tasty because it's helpful and useful for the body to function normally. The problem is just as with sugar, for example, in the past was a scarce resource. Fruit was scarce, energy was scarce. So as soon as we found some of it, we wanted to consume as much as possible. But in the modern world, if we overconsume sugar, we can become obese, especially in the refined form. Similarly, our taste for salt served a purpose in the past, but we can overconsume it today when exposed to excess. Therefore, it's prudent and correct, and according to all known science, that we want to limit our intake of sugar and of salt to the degree to which we need it to function normally. And for sugar, limit in the form of fruits, and for salt, limit to a certain amount of intake over the day. Now, in this dissection of this video that I'm now going to undertake, I'm going to affirm and validate where Huberman gets things right and where he gets things terribly wrong. A broad overview of this is as follows. For the first 46 minutes, Huberman, I believe, is simply giving a medical school lecture. I believe that this 46 minutes is roughly the same length as a medical school lecture. I believe it's probably a medical school lecture he's given before to medical students. It is basic physiology of osmotic regulation with a particular neuroscience focus. So many courses in the physiology of the regulation of osmolarity of the blood, that is to say, many medical school courses that talk about how the concentration of various electrolytes are regulated in the blood to not produce too high of levels or too low of levels, because you don't want either. You want a well-regulated concentration of salt in the blood. Many of them do not focus necessarily so much on the brain. Usually they focus on the kidney. But Huberman's area of expertise is the brain. And so what I suspect is that this is his version of giving that lecture with a neuroscientific focus from his point of view of his area of expertise, which is all well and good. As a very compelling and powerful speaker, perhaps one of the most powerful speakers in this space of lifestyle, health, nutrition, alternative health, a major YouTuber and now podcaster, and a very influential influencer. Huberman is in some ways perhaps unparalleled in his delivery and the power with which he conveys information. And so that's a very fine lecture. It's a very competent lecture, it sounds to me. As somebody who knows a bit about the regulation of osmolarity, who took those lectures, at least with respect to mostly the kidney. But it sounds very reasonable. And I think it sounds rock solid to me, that first 46 minutes. It sounds like a medical school lecture. The thing is nobody, the thing that is funny, although unsurprising, is that nobody really is concerned so much with this part of the podcast. Nobody memorizes all of this part of the podcast because most people who are watching the podcast are more interested in whether they should change the amount of salt they're taking in. Most people who are interested in this podcast will be interested in the practical aspect. So what this first 46 minutes actually achieves, however, is it allows for Huberman to introduce his topic and sound very systematic and intelligent and very basic science oriented and rigorous and robust and solid, which is what that first 46 minutes is. And then he goes off the deep end into areas that have nothing to do with the current body of evidence and scientific literature about sodium, salt intake, and health. So there is a very interesting strategy that's going on here. He starts with some area related to the regulation of thirst, mainly thirst and the excretion of water to maintain osmolarity, osmotic homeostasis. And then he launches into an entirely different topic that is somewhat related, but not built upon the first 46 minutes whatsoever. The knowledge does not build upon the first 46 minutes, but it appears to maybe a layperson that these things are related and one is building off the other. It is not. The second part is an excursion, a tangent into an area that is unrelated to the first 46 minutes. Contrary to what appearances might suggest to somebody who has not thoroughly investigated this topic or is not in the medical field. But it makes it appear as if the second part of the podcast is on firmer ground than it actually is. Because again, while it appears that the first 46 minutes lays a foundation for the rest of the podcast, in fact, the first 46 minutes has very little to do scientifically with everything that comes after. And this first 46 minutes, as I mentioned, is quite competent, and thus I will not be discussing it in this podcast. It's excellent. Go listen to it if you want to hear and understand and get a crash course in the physiology of osmotic regulation, by all means. However, everything that comes after is suspect, more than suspect. And in this podcast, that is what I'm going to be dissecting, analyzing, and breaking apart, and explaining what the science of salt and sodium intake actually says. Not because I have any supplements to sell, but because my brand, my social media brand, is truth-telling. And I have my own incentive here is to strengthen that brand. So I'll tell you the facts, whether or not you like them, whether or not I like them. And by doing so again and again, in episode after episode of my podcast, I gain the trust of my viewers. I'm not always right. Sometimes I'm wrong. And in fact, I think in the next podcast I do, or the podcast after, I'm going to discuss all the ways in which I've been wrong over the last couple months. But I firmly cleave to truth. And I like the fact that I'm building a strong brand around that. My incentive is to build this brand and to build it really strong. And then I will have a lot of people who listen to me and take me very seriously. And with that, there's a lot of leverage that I can use. That's my goal in this podcast, to tell you what's true and to gain your trust if you're willing to follow me into this area and listen. And in return, of course, you will gain an understanding of exactly what you need to do and not do for your health with respect to salt. So, let's start by looking at the outline of this podcast. As I've mentioned, the first 46 minutes is pure physiology, all the way up till 45, 46. How much salt do you need? And at that point, although that seems to be a continuation of the rest, in fact, it is not, as I've said, it is a completely different topic. Now, the first 46 minutes do talk about salt, but mainly just how salt regulates thirst, salt in the blood, right? How does salt regulate thirst? The rest has nothing to do with physiology about how salt regulates thirst, or even about how any of these parts of the brain or the kidney, etc., do any of that. It's about anxiety, and it's about some storytelling about anxiety and about mental performance and physical performance and neurons and stuff like that. That has nothing to do with the physiology. Okay? But let's keep reading what the rest of the podcast looks like. So half the topics are covered in the first 46 minutes, as we can see. And then we start, how much salt do you need? Should you increase your salt intake? So by 56 minutes, after the first 10 minutes of going on to talk about how much salt you need, should you increase your salt intake? And for the next 6 minutes, he'll make the case that you do. And then thereafter, tools to determining your individual salt intake for the next 12 minutes thereafter, so 18 minutes total, he makes a case for increasing salt intake. So it seems like we have 46 minutes of introduction, but that's not at all related to what he's going to be talking about. As soon as he gets into what he wants to talk about, you have 10 minutes of introduction until he starts to pitch to you that you should increase your salt intake. Okay? Then he expands upon all of that in the rest of the podcast, concluding with a finally at an hour, 55 minutes, what salt intake is best for you? Okay. Meaning, for many people, they benefit. And we'll go through each of these parts in turn in the course of this dissection of the podcast. Now, as I do this, I've mentioned on Twitter that I will be using minimal editing. And what that means is that instead of releasing it all as one podcast, I'm going to release it in parts. So I'll do maybe 20 or 30 minutes a day of recording covering a substantial proportion of the podcast, the dissection, the analysis of the podcast, and then I'll just release that until I'm done. And then I'll splice all that together and put it into one big video. So with that said, if you liked this video, check out the part 2. And of course, check me out on Instagram, Patreon, Twitter, TikTok at Kevin and Bass, KEVINNBASS. Check the Kevin Bass Show out on YouTube and on Spotify podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and rate and review me, because that helps people to know that this is legit and this is good stuff. Again, this is just the introduction of the full analysis. I need to get to the rest shortly. It's not going to take too long. I'm just going to focus on a few papers because that's really all that he bases his case on. And that's going to be interesting. It's going to be fun. So if you want to see me take apart those papers, because again, it's not based on the physiology. The physiology is sort of a separate lecture that he kind of shoehorned into the podcast. It's a funny thing that he did, but it's not based on that. It's going to be based on these other papers that he has that he's citing, and a book that he cites as well. And we'll be taking apart all of that in the future parts. And hopefully we'll get done with this in less than an hour total. And that's my goal. And leave feedback. If you have any feedback, it'd be much appreciated. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.